What's happening on the Gulf Coast is, to be very blunt, the Gulf Coast is drowning. A combination of erosion, sea level rise, and subsidence we've lost about 2,000 square miles since the 1930s, and we're on track to lose maybe another 2,000 square miles by 2050 or 2060, depending on how things go. Since looks like many of you have been there, I don't need to really explain the implications of that, but they're tremendous, both for the economics of the region and for the country, of course, for the ecosystem there, fisheries, and for, of course, the people who live there and the communities who are on the coast there and have been there for a very, very long time. So the question that we're really going to wrestle with today is, what are we going to do about it, and what can be done about it? There's a $50 billion Gulf Coast restoration plan, $50 billion over the next 50 years. That involves a lot of interesting, innovative engineering, from improving drainage to sediment dams, diversion dams that change the flow of the river to help rebuild some of the barrier islands. It's really, this Gulf project is really the sort of forefront of coastal engineering in America, and in the world, arguably. This idea of how can we redesign this place, and how can we save it, and what does it mean to save it? What does that really mean? What is our goal here in doing this? So I am totally thrilled to be here talking with you about this, with this group of people who are the dream team, I would say, of panelists for a topic like this. Kathy McLeod here, who is the Senior VP for Global Environmental Social Risk at Bank of America. She was with the Nature Conservancy for 5 years prior to this, has worked all over the world on coastal restoration, is an expert in finance and thinking about how this is going to be paid for, among other things. Kate Orff is one of the rock stars, I think is fair to say, of the landscape and design world. Co-founded a design shop called Scape in New York. Is done a lot of work all around the world. Also, a number of projects in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and the Rebuild by Design competition there. And then we have Rob Walton, who I think probably needs not much introduction in this crowd here. Former chairman of the board at Walton Family Foundation board member, who's been deeply involved in the Gulf Coast for a long time in this restoration project. So to start the conversation, I think, because this is a dark, difficult subject, and this is early morning, I want you each, like in 1 minute or so, to tell me what you're optimistic about in this, and then we can go into the details of the trouble with that optimism. But tell me, give me like your what's optimistic about what's happening in this Gulf restoration plan and what's happening in the Gulf right now. Kevin.
I am optimistic because there are billions and billions of dollars looking for a good place to invest in things that are good for people and good for the planet. And the demand for sustainable finance is immense. And if we find the right combination of financial mechanisms and the blended finance that we need for the scale of restoration that is needed in the Gulf Coast, we can get there. The money is there.
That's interesting. Okay.
All right. I am very optimistic because I feel like, as much as the tragedy of the oil spill and that occurred, that has given us an opportunity, and we have to take that opportunity. I feel like the engineering, our conceptions of engineering have changed. And at this very moment where we have something like up to $15 billion available for coastal restoration and ecosystem projects, that conception of engineering is there to meet it. And so I feel like there's a great convergence of of the financial means together with this new mindset about what infrastructure is going to mean for the next century. And I think it's going to be green infrastructure. I think it's going to be infrastructure that's living and alive and that sort of embraces the functionality and the beauty, if you will, of natural systems.
Rob?
So I am optimistic for those reasons, but there's a combination of political will, public support, science-based solutions, and these resources, and it hasn't been that way, and it wasn't that way automatically. We've been working there for certainly since 2002 or so, and early days we spent money on demonstration projects, we being our foundation, and whatnot, and there just weren't the resources, plus not the focus. We worked to get the settlement dollars focused on environmental restoration instead of public service projects, the kind of things politicians might otherwise do. That was successful. Now Mississippi is unanimous. The Louisiana has unanimously approved the Coastal Restoration Plan, which is a big deal, and science-based, 17 projects of various expense and effectiveness. I'm very optimistic. This could have gone a different way, and I am optimistic.
So Rob, so tell me about why the foundation is involved in this. I mean, there's many things that you are, obviously there are many things you are doing, but you're putting a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of interest into this. What is it about this project that is driving your?
Well, we've had, as I say, been involved in the Mississippi and the Louisiana coast for a long time, but when the Deepwater Horizon accident actually goes back to Katrina. That disaster showed how vulnerable this area is. I was, of course, with Walmart at the time, and we shipped 2,450 truckloads of relief supplies in. Became an effort, beginning of a whole department on disaster relief that we have across the world. Then we had Deepwater Horizon, and we saw this as an opportunity to leverage. Philanthropy, private philanthropy, can't do much on its own. In this case, it was an opportunity to leverage in the way I described a minute ago, the settlement, moving that forward, and now working with local grantees and community to secure the funding for well-designed projects, including in particular these diversions, river diversions, sediment diversions.
Right. So Kate, I think it's important to talk a little bit about what's different about this engineering, this plan that we're talking about now. I mean, and I think it's also important to say that a lot of the problems on the Gulf Coast are man-made. I mean, one of the reasons we're having so much problem with sediment being washed out is because of what the Army Corps of Engineers did in sort of reshaping the river in the 60s and 70s during their projects. A lot of the erosion and subsidence has to do with canals that were cut in the area by the oil and gas industry. We of course had the BP oil spill. I mean, so this place is thinking about the idea of nature here is a complicated notion. And it's also a complicated notion thinking about what engineering can do and why we who care about this should have faith that we can do it better now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of screwed the place up in a way.
That's right.
And what's different now?
I guess one thing I definitely wanted to talk about is, well, so this is a portrait, if you see on the screen, of this kind of looped and living bayou, right? I think this is probably the landscape of your childhood along the Mississippi, right, where you have this thick, rich, biodiverse bayou, primarily supported by fishing and aquaculture and so on. And I think one of the challenges is that we have humanity across the globe, not just, this is one example of a deltaic landscape that has been massively modified over time. But over the years, human settlement occurs, right? Everything in yellow you see here, the squiggle of the Mississippi River, that has been levied in order to prevent flood control. But I think, and that is kind of a singular function way of thinking about infrastructure, right? Levy equals lack of flood. And I think what we're all realizing now is that we're living with the legacy of the incredible efficacious infrastructure that we have built, largely of sort of concrete, and to channel rivers where we want them to go, to prevent flooding from certain places. But now what we're learning, I guess the levees were built in the 30s, something like that. Less than 100 years later, of the unintended consequences of those decisions. And so what's the challenge now is that levee is basically funneling all of the sediment that used to nourish everything that you see here in sort of dark teal, and kind of replenish those wetlands over time, re-sediment them so that they can kind of just keep up as a natural dynamic system. And so by depriving those wetlands of that rich sediment, they are subsiding and they're being increasingly hit by storms and there are drownings. So what's so exciting about this project is I think that it's a sort of a hybrid of old and new, where we're beginning to sort of unlock that channel at very critical points and allowing that sediment to go through and replenish the wetlands. And what else is important is I think we're thinking much more holistically and in 3 dimensions, if you will, and understanding the richness and complexity of ecosystems and their incredible protective value. So rather than just focus in one place, this plan is looking at creating a transect, like of offshore oyster reefs, of wetland restoration in the middle ground, and also of unlocking that sediment where it needs to be unlocked along the levees. So we're thinking more holistically, we're thinking more about a systems approach rather than, well, here's one infrastructure solution that's going to solve this one problem and then create all kinds of new problems. And I'm hoping, because we're designing with nature in mind and in this 3-dimensional and holistic systems way, that we will be creating less unintended consequences than we have in the last, say, 100 years of civil engineering.
That's one of the things that you hear when you talk about these ideas is the idea that and you touched on it a little bit, but just expand a little bit on this idea of the river as a sort of engine of restoration. I mean, it's actually, it's something that it's a virtue to have that there, unlike other places like, say, South Florida, which has a lot of issues with coastal flooding and all the kinds of things that we're talking about here. It does not have a Mississippi River as an engine of restoration. So just explain that idea a little bit. I mean, you talked about it with the resedimentation, but just expand on that a little bit.
Well, I think the Mississippi is, it's America's river, really. It's this iconic, and that's why I'm so thrilled that all this work is happening here, because it means so much not only for the American landscape, but for other deltaic cities and places globally. But the river itself is this incredible engine, right? It is an engine of sediment. It is fish habitat. It's so many different things, and I think, by unlocking it in these very specific ways, I think we have 2 specific sediment diversion projects that are moving forward in the short term. But that just means that it's not a quick fix. It's something that enables this evolution of change to happen over time, and not to be, I know your book is called The Water Will Come, right. So I know where you probably stand on the optimism, pessimism stand, but I truly believe that we are in a race against time for some of these landscapes where literally the rate of sea level rise needs to be matched by the rate of resedimentation. And so with this project, we're starting to be able to get there, to make a more sustainable kind of solution rather than just a one-off moment in time that is, one and done. The river becomes an engine for ongoing future restoration.
Right. So, Kathy, you get the hardest question, which is, this all sounds great, and I would love for Kate to just go down there and do it all. But the question is, where does the money come from? I mean, we're talking about a $50 billion project in a state that does not have a lot of excess cash to throw around right now. A federal government who is not throwing tons of cash around for projects like this. You have some money from the BP oil spill settlement, of course, but in the big picture, thinking about where this funding is going to come from is really complex. And talk about how that might work and what the prospects for that are.
So first of all, I want to ask, who in the audience is familiar with the term ecosystem service? Have you heard that phrase? And I think it's worth saying that an ecosystem service is a service that an ecosystem is providing. So this rivers and coastal system is providing a service. And think about oyster reefs and coral reefs and mangroves and marshes. They provide wave attenuation. They break waves before they hit the shore. And so they are reducing the risk of storms and floods. So that's one example of ecosystem service. Also, think about how we filter and clean our water before it hits the aquifer through a natural system. And so when you start to think about how to pay for something, you think about what is the service that this particular system is providing, and who's the recipient of the service, and is there an economic actor that's receiving the service, and are they currently paying for it? And oftentimes you'll find that the beneficiaries of an ecosystem service are free riding. They're enjoying that ecosystem service, and oftentimes they don't even know that they're the beneficiary of that service. And so one of the things to think about when you think about a complex system like this, and I want to highlight this project as emblematic of places like this around the world, as Kate referenced, that climate change is exacerbating the conditions that we see in the Gulf Coast. And so things that make storms bigger, make floods bigger, make droughts drier, all those sorts of things. So think about the combination of the vulnerability of this community and the vulnerability of the people and their jobs. So that the economic actors are not just big businesses, they're people that are fishing and harvesting oysters and providing tours and those sorts of things. So they're all, of course, inextricably linked. And so if you think about how does the money flow in a community like this, and what kind of service is the natural system providing, and to whom? And is there a relationship sufficient to create a financial mechanism that can bring private money to help support and restore this natural system? And so, as Jeff said, sometimes these systems they're complex. They're not all natural. In New Jersey, you see that we're taking sediment from out in the bay and blowing it into wetlands to create more call it density in the wetlands so that it can absorb more waves and more floods. And so the relationship between nature and the way that we use the coastline is complex. And so let me talk about a compendium of funding. So you think about, and first I really have to commend the Walton Foundation for 16 years of focus on an area is just incredible to stay focused on the needs of a community. And so formerly from being with a nonprofit at the Nature Conservancy and now being at Bank of America, to see that focus to last for so long is really impressive. And I would say that but for the Walton Foundation, you wouldn't see the progress and the success in this area. So I have to say that. And I should say I'm not received funding from the Walton Foundation. That is not gratuitous, I assure you. Secondly, thinking about a compendium of funding, you think about philanthropy on one end and capital markets on the other end. And so there are lots of things in between. And so many of you have likely heard of blended finance. And so you're looking for all the different ways that you can leverage different types of money. And so you have philanthropy, and we all understand that, and you have capital markets. That's market rate return on an investment. And there have been really interesting sessions in the last day or two about investing. And so when you think about market rate and philanthropy and what's in between, you think about how would, if this natural system is reducing risk to the community, how do you make money saving money? How do you do that? If the oyster reefs are breaking waves and protecting assets on the shore, how do you make money from that reduction of risk? And so there are mechanisms that can be created in here, but the creativity is between the philanthropy and the capital markets products. So there are catastrophe bonds being created around nature-based risk reduction. There are impact investment funds that are being created. And I'm sure we'd find here at the Aspen Ideas Festival many, many people that are involved in the creation of stewardship of these funds. But we get more and more creative in gatherings like this and with people with this kind of experience to figure out how to pay for it. And so I think, just to wrap up, because we don't have that much time, that the answer to how we pay for it is it will be a blend. And I think we have to experiment a little bit with mechanisms. And some people are happy to put some money in as long as they have capital returned, so a 0% interest. There are lots of places that want to see new mechanisms started. And the key is replicability and scalability. And that's what attracts a lot of capital and a lot of in terms of a risk appetite for investing in something like this. So I'll stop there. This is a very exciting topic. You can see.
No, it is, and it's really an important topic. I mean, yesterday in my conversation with Christiana Figueres, we were talking about the difference between mitigation and adaptation, and we talked about the point that for investing in clean energy technology and things, it's a pretty straightforward path to returns. You build you do something that makes a cheaper solar panel. It's pretty clear how you get investment returns on that. How you get investment returns on adaptation, on everything from seawalls to drainage projects, all these sorts of things that need to happen. They're not sexy. It's not easy to see what the path back on the return of investment is. So it's a very tricky emerging finance model that I know you're at the forefront of. So Rob, what is the role of philanthropy in all of this? I mean, both in funding, in the sense of it's not obviously something that you can just do. You have a certain amount of influence and money that you can put towards this. How do you think of the sort of kind of leverage that you have and the best use of that leverage?
Well, the funding pales in potential philanthropic funding pales in relation to a $50 billion project, of course. So all we can do is participate in moving things along. And as I mentioned before, we've got huge leverage with the resource, the $8 billion that's allocated to Louisiana, or more maybe, potentially more from the spill. My thought is that as these projects are shown to be effective, and our target is for the first diversion to begin operation by 2020. That may be a little optimistic, but some things have fallen the right way recently that might make that possible. And as we see that these designs are going to be effective, I think funding will be available, and we're way above my pay grade here when trying to figure out what they are. But I think when you show effectiveness, because that hasn't existed before, and this initial down payment, which is 30%, the $15 billion is 30% of the total. That's a big part of it, and so I think this will work, and I think philanthropy could be kind of help establish guideposts and parameters for the operation. And of course, all this has to be done through grantees and local people. That's where the action has to happen.
Kathy, I know you're going to say something. Let me ask you one follow-up, though. So how do you think about navigating, from a philanthropic point of view, the complex politics of this? I mean, this is an engineering project, but it's also highly political in the sense of who gets the money, what gets saved, what doesn't get saved. How do you think about your level of engagement on that?
I think that our objective is to have science-based alternatives presented, but the decisions are not for, I mentioned last night a retired philanthropist from Arizona that wants to try to help out.
Right.
These are decisions that need to be made locally,
right.
Unquestionably. And there is a remarkable, there'll be consequences, as we all know, negative consequences, as we all know, but there's remarkable acceptance of the fact that something needs to be done. And as I say, the plan has been very well accepted. I think it's sound.
Kathy, you wanted to say?
I just wanted to mention, I think this is where you were going, Rob, about leveraging the philanthropy, and that there are currently experimentation with pay for performance bonds happening in the Gulf region for how the restoration performs, and the community gets paid for the kind of restoration, and that is seeded by philanthropy. The other is that Bank of America has something called the Catalytic Finance Initiative, and we've made a commitment of $1 billion of our balance sheet, and we are leveraging that with $9 billion of partners. And some of those partners are multilateral development banks, but they're also philanthropy. And so we are already engaged in getting to $10 billion of impact in both climate mitigation and adaptation. And so this fits squarely into the adaptation space. And so there are mechanisms and efforts and money flowing already in this direction, and it is made possible in large part by philanthropy.
I really like the phrasing of guideposts too, because I do feel like that in all of these cases, there are so many small things that can go wrong, or the money can get diverted to, I don't know, a road widening project or whatever it is. And the notion of just kind of this partner, kind of not a silent partner, but a partner who's, observing, watching, kind of encouraging, is really strong. And I think that sort of outside view just is really helpful in these situations to kind of keep things moving and on track. And there's so much credibility built into the Walton kind of foundation and name that must be incredibly helpful.
So Kay, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this project that I want to ask you about is one of the big picture truths about our world now is that we're living in a world that's rapidly changing. That we're living at a time of climate change. We're living at a time when more and more extreme weather, more and more, we just don't really know, where things are going. We don't know if we're going to have 1 or 2 feet of sea level rise in the next century, or we're going to have 6 or 8 feet. We don't know about if a 1 in 500 year storm, does the idea still hold, or are we going to move into in Maryland, we just had 2 1 in 1,000 year storms basically back to back, right? So we're in this age of uncertainty. And we're talking about an engineering project here that, you have to think about, what are you engineering for? Mm-hmm. And so as someone who thinks about, re-engineering a coastline and what's going on here, how do you deal with uncertainty? I mean, because that seems to me to be a central notion that's new here, that's different than before. So how do you think about that?
This framework of uncertainty is certainly the framework in which we're all operating now. I have to always think that it was always that way. The world was always uncertain. We just had kind of different assumptions about it. Right. Yeah. Whereas it's like, I'm going to, in my 30s, I'm going to put this levee in, and that will be no more flooding, right? But that obviously is not the case. So on the one hand, I feel like it's very useful because we're operating in this framework of trying to anticipate multiple outcomes. And the way I think, and I think many people think, is this notion of scenarios, right? Like you kind of play through multiple scenarios and test them out over different time periods. But in every case, and I think that's one of the big achievements of this plan that was unanimously passed, was that it was based on the best available science. And I think that we can say this is uncertain, nevertheless we have to act on the best available science that we have now. And so in all of our work, we are simply moving forward based on those predictions. And I also feel like there's a kind of an openness to the way that we need to think about our landscapes to begin to accommodate new realities. In a lot of cases, in the past, I feel like the Dutch model, which was something that was immediately kind of here after Superstorm Sandy in the New York region, was a little bit of a red herring, because the Dutch model is based on purely a sea level rise scenario and purely kind of stopping the water. And although there's a lot of new innovation there with sand engines and other kinds of forms of engineering with nature, but at the same time, we have very different situation here. We have hurricanes, we have much more extreme rain events. And so the idea of placing just a singular levee and thinking, I'm going to designed for coastal flooding.
Right.
That simply means when you have your 1 in 1,000-year rain event, then you have a flood. So if that is not kind of properly, accommodated for with deep sort of absorptive wetlands, and so I just think we're thinking differently. We're kind of looking at multiple phases of risk around different kind of extreme weather phenomena, and I truly
modeling is so sophisticated.
Right, and so we've also made a lot of progress in this in designing and modeling in a very iterative way. Like all the maps that you see here are all GIS maps, and we've been working with engineers to literally test real-time scenarios with different storm modeling conditions, different rain wave models, and literally kind of work in a very quick and iterative way to understand what the efficacious, how efficacious these kind of landscape ecosystem interventions are. And I guess I want to end on a positive note. I'm sorry, but I had this slide of land loss. But I think the other thing that to keep in mind is we're talking about. I hate the word risk, even though I know it's, but we're also talking about life on Earth, right? And these ecosystem engineering projects are a win-win in that situation, right? They are going to reduce risk. They are going to,
create habitat.
And at the same time, just think of, I'm sure if anyone here has canoed in the Bayou, or you know this kind of incredible diversity of species that depends on this thick ecosystem of wetlands and marshes and reefs, and so I feel like with these demonstration projects, they are a win-win, and because we will be preserving some of this habitat that is so necessary, and I definitely feel like a robust, rich, environment is something that is ultimately deeply protective, and it also has its own, ethics and morality around just preserving spaces for other species to exist.
So I just wanted to let you know I didn't say earlier, but we're happy to have audience questions in a few minutes. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and then start thinking about anything you'd like to ask our fabulous panelists here, and we'll do that in just a second. But Kathy, I wanted to ask you, so one of my kind of theories is that when we look at these kinds of projects, the Gulf Coast and other places that are facing major changes as a result of sea level rise or increased rainfall and stuff, is that we can't save everything, right? It's a false notion to think we're just going to sort of fix the Gulf Coast and just kind of carry on as we have before, right? So that we're kind of in a triage moment, really, in a sense of what do we want to save, what do we not want to save, what do we value, what do we not value, and that goes to money, in the sense of what are we going to spend it on, right? I mean, there's not an infinite sum, even if we could conjure up the $50 billion through bonds and whatever, it's still not an infinite fund, and it's still going to require decisions made. So I'd just like to hear you think a little bit about how we make those decisions and how we decide, we meaning collectively, the people who are thinking about this, what to spend the money on and what not. Is it going to be driven purely by politics? Is it going to be driven purely by investment return? Is it going to be driven by whoever has the loudest voice gets saved? And what about the dolphins and the oysters? And I mean, how do we think about this sort of triage moment from a financial point of view? Well,
one thing I would start with is how incredibly local those decisions are. And Rob, you mentioned the certainty with which that plan was approved, and I think it was approved. Was it 5 years ago, and it was approved 10 years ago? So there is clearly the political will to create this plan. I think to say it's all one way or all the other, it is going to be a combination of things. And the politics are important, and the public money is important. And to think about what we save, I think this landscape is so fundamentally altered from early on, from thinking about the Everglades and the attempt to straighten the Kissimmee River and the mosquito, try to stop the mosquito infestation or oil and gas exploration in this particular area. The landscape is altered. And so what our notion of what the natural landscape is up for our creation and our shaping. And we've done that over and over again. And so this plan is, again, a reflection of current priorities, current political realities, current constraints on funding. But I think if we stay true to people and to what the needs of the community are and the essential underpinning of what nature does to allow us to continue to exist, which is the point you're making about just think about these coastal wetlands. 90% of the fish that we eat spend their childhood in these wetlands. This isn't something that we're disconnected from, of course. And so staying true to that and understanding that there are places that will have to be restored by necessity, and there'll be things that we'll look back on, and I'm sure we're doing that now. I could point to some and say, wow, wish we'd done that differently. But the best available science with the money you have, with the very best intentions and political alignment, and that's it.
Well, I think that's a very, very profound point, because I think that, the idea of nature is gone there, right? This is a place, this is a man-made landscape now, and it's what we...
that seems a little...
Well,
Nature's
it's not that natural things are gone, but it's that
pristine,
right.
untouched
It's not like
nature.
the redwood forests of the it's a place that has the fingerprint of
Absolutely.
humans deeply embedded
Lots of
into
them.
it, right? And so
Yeah.
these choices that we're going to make in how we do this project and where the money goes, how we shape things, is going to reflect our values in a very profound way. And I think that's what's so thrilling about this project and so empowering and kind of hopeful ultimately, is that we will choose what kind of world we want to rebuild there and how much we care about it and what we care about. And I think that's...
And I think you see that ethic reflected in people in generations behind mine, that there's an understanding. And over time, even over the 16 years that you've been investing in this region, think about the awareness that we all have about our relationship to nature and the changes that we're seeing and the way, even in some of the social movements that we've seen. So we are our best selves right now.
Let's hope. Questions? Craig. And when you ask questions, please introduce yourself. And as often said, just questions, please, not statements. Just.
Good morning. Craig McLean from NOAA. I'm curious, as a federal person, how the panelists, and Jeff also, not to put you on the spot, but as an author who has written on these subjects, I'm interested in how each panelist might see the federal role to be enhanced. Do we need legislative changes so that the federal government can work more compatibly together? Legislative changes potentially so that we can commingle funds in a more constructive way? I'd love your thoughts. Thank you.
Can I just be really brief first? I would say Oval Office changes might be a good place to begin. But that's just me. Kathy?
Let Rob go next.
Me?
Role of the federal, right?
Federal? So Congress just made a change to, or created an exception to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. I have it more or less right. This is a little out of my field. But for these diversion projects, there are a few dolphins hanging around in this newly saltwater area, and doing the diversions will create fresh water, and those dolphins are going to have to move, and they will, just the way they came in there. So that's an example of federal cooperation. There is permitting has been accelerated for these projects, and that's very encouraging. I'm not sure it's at the scale that you're thinking, but my interest is in getting this going and seeing what happens. And so those are some examples where federal and state, the state is taking over some of the permitting also for one of the projects, and federal for the other, I think. And we'll see how that goes, but I'm encouraged.
Yeah. I mean, I see a great opportunity for the federal government to help identify, almost like 10, if you will, or a small amount of fast track projects where they could be identified as pilots, and they could be, because right now we have a project called Living Breakwaters in Raritan Bay in New York, and this is going through what anyone would kind of glaze over if I started to discuss the alphabet soup of permitting of U.S. Army Corps, Fish and Wildlife Service, all the kind of regulatory and all of those regulations are in place each separately for a fantastic reason. Taken together, they add years of time, 5 years of time, incredible expense, and they slow the projects down to the point where they can just become admired. And I do feel like even if the federal government were to say, here's 5 just risk reduction related projects that we could try to advance as pilots and hold them up as these examples, I feel like that would be incredibly powerful and helpful. And just by calling them a pilot, right, you can create a window of possibility to get them through what is often a regulatory morass. And a second thing, if I may take a tiny bit more time, is that the United States Army Corps of Engineers is filled with incredible people who want to do the right thing, civil servants who know exactly. And the way that the Army Corps of Engineers is structured is such that these co-benefits of projects that we are all talking about, which is public health benefit, risk reduction, habitat creation, in the way that these projects are evaluated by the Army Corps of Engineers, it doesn't really cross those lines. So projects are based solely on risk reduction, whereas something that we're talking about here may not may not pass muster.
Right.
But it also has these incredible habitat benefits. So one, and we've presented to the Army Corps of Engineers multiple times. They all know that's the future, but the way that they're structured is such that they're segmented into silos. So I feel like some pilot projects with Army Corps that help them bridge those current gaps would be tremendously catalytic.
And I'll pass in the interest of time, and
Okay.
Craig and I will
Other,
catch up.
just me get some in the back of the room. Yeah.
My name is Benton Castman, and I am from Texas, and I'm going to revisit an old idea that was brought up about 40 years ago, and that's the idea of piping water from the Mississippi to drier areas. I know there's going to be the upside of getting water to dry areas and the possibility of lowering some of the flood risk, but I know there's a lot of other issues that probably kept it from happening. But the idea of piping water out of the Mississippi to drier areas, could y'all discuss the ups and downs of that idea?
Anybody have any?
I don't have any expertise.
Kate, do you
Well, I
know
know
anything?
I believe Walton is also involved in the Colorado River. I mean, that might be an example of
We could use it.
a challenge, with that kind of philosophy. It's probably well known, but by the time that river reaches the border, it's essentially gone. So, I sort of feel like there's ways that you can begin to develop smaller loops of sort of rainwater capture and begin to work much more in a micro way in situations and in places where that doesn't require mass diversions of water that kind of remakes large areas of the landscape. I mean, another small example would be maybe lots of ideas. Folks here are always from the Bay Area. If you think about the San Francisco Baylands and the incredible infrastructure that has the entire state of California is pumping water here and there's literally a almost systematic collapse of fisheries population, salmon, smelt, et cetera. And so I sort of feel like in my naivete, I feel like what's good for fish is good for people, like water that can continue and be, and that sort of means sediment is flowing. That means people will have food to eat. And so I tend to try to design and would make decisions with those kinds of criteria in mind, and rather than reintroduce these kind of mega engineering projects that have largely created more problems.
Andy?
This is a great discussion and a great investment by Walton Foundation. Andy Refkin, newcomer at National Geographic Society, where we're trying to make information matter. That's the question. I wanted to ask you how much you think this is a communication challenge. The designs are all there. The ideas, the basic science is crystal clear. The Orff Foundation out in the West is working on the same question for wildfire zones, but the same issue is the one that Kathy identified. It's all local. And all the reporting I've done the last 15 years in danger zones, you get rollbacks. Right now, 18 states in the Gulf and the Atlantic have rolled back their building codes, for example, in the face of what we know about change. So what's the importance of communication, and what would that look like?
Want to take that one?
I can take that one.
Yeah, great, Kathy.
I think the role of communication is essential and critical to people's understanding of, and in the conversation with Brock Long yesterday that you facilitated, Andy, the FEMA administrator did a panel that I hope some of you saw. He was incredibly authentic and shared the realities of the really complex role that he plays, but part of it is the idea that people have, he called it disaster amnesia. And it would seem that if you roll back building codes that are protecting people and property, that would fit into that category. And so to see the way that we're now communicating, the way that we use our phones, the way that people move money, everything's changing. Everything is real time and right now. And so I think the communication channels are there. It is a question of defining the audience and defining what you want them to do with the information that you've provided to them. And so thinking from Bank of America perspective, we have millions of customers, and I hope many of you have your Bank of America app. Don't raise your hands, that's okay. But that is another opportunity, those types of communication channels. So rolling back the building code is counterproductive to the safety of communities, and it also happened in Florida. It did.
But it's also a result of, to put it bluntly, a kind of economic desperation. I mean, as these places are getting more inundated, more flood losses and things, people will begin to retreat and begin to leave in order to encourage development and building in these areas. City officials, county officials, state officials are tempted to do things like that, making it easier and cheaper to build there in order to encourage people to do it and to keep the economy alive there to some degree and to keep people there, which is of course counterproductive to risk reduction and everything else. So it is a short-term thinking, and I think the failure of communication just broadly is on the sort of longer-term consequences of this. Everything is about, this year, next year, this political cycle, what I need to do to get reelected, that kind of thing, and not any real political vision and leadership, business leadership also on this in a longer sense, in the longer term. Anyway, another question? Yes, over there.
Where does insurance come into this?
So,
Kathy, yeah.
Insurance is a key player in all of this. The insurance industry is a partner in the Gulf restoration. The insurance industry manages risk and prices risk better than anybody else. Understanding the exposure that the insurance companies, so there's insurance and then there's reinsurance, and insurance is your homeowner's policy, and then reinsurance is the company that insures that insurance company. There are also reinsurance companies, but so thinking about insurance as the place where they understand and manage the risk. Insurers are also investors, and so they are just second to pension funds, the largest investors. They have, I think it's $17 trillion in assets under management. So
why is insurance not preventing the kind of reduction in the housing standards? Why is insurance not
Stepping up.
Insurance is managed at the state level by state level insurance commissioners. And so insurance rates are regulated at the state. And so that's one factor. The other is that they are involved in this, but in the US, the federal government is the flood insurer. So the National Flood Insurance Program is a public insurance program. So there are private companies that are providing some of the National Flood Insurance Program, and the NFIP, this is getting too technical, but they play a role in this. And the idea that the world is, if the temperature of the planet raises or gets to 3 or 3.5 degrees, there have been CEOs of insurance companies that say the world is uninsurable at that temperature. And so that creates a question of the model of the insurance company as the backup of the risk that all of these communities are facing. So those state level decisions, back to Andy's point about building code, the insurance companies are there at the table, but those decisions are also local.
Right. But to your point, the National Flood Insurance Program needs a complete reboot, and it's one of these, and that is sort of the, what did you say, the underpinning of many of these other, decision kind
Financial
of matrix.
relationships.
Yes,
Yep,
and
yep,
so that is definitely something underpinning all of these decisions and all of the kind of coastal rebuilding projects.
And the cost of
it
insurance
should
is a political
change.
issue
Yeah.
at the state level. So the cost of your insurance premium, particularly in these coastal vulnerable states, is a political issue. And so the decisions made about your insurance rates are made at a state executive branch level. And so if you as a homeowner that you want to have affordable property insurance, if the state can change the rate, that is a decision that's not based on actuaries or actuarial science. And so that becomes another issue, which is where the NFIP gets into the position it's in, which is outside of my scope.
And just to pull, because insurance does drive many other decisions. I showed a project yesterday called Unlocking Alameda Creek, just in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is this concept at a much smaller scale, which is trying to resediment the baylands. And the challenge is in that case, the Alameda has been canalized, and of course, suburban homes have been built up next to it, and those homes are insured federally because of and even modifying that canalized creek a very tiny bit impacts that flood insurance. So it's locking in the kind of current landscape dynamics, and it will be key to sort of making more systemic change.
So we could talk about flood insurance for days, because that is very important and complex subject.
Can we do a next year Aspen Ideas?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's worth, it's a huge issue.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we have to wrap up. And I want to thank you all for coming here, and I want to especially thank these wonderful panelists, such brilliant conversation, and I'm very privileged to be here with them, and thank you all, and we'll see you around.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.